Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, we see the Apostle Paul giving Timothy instructions in connection to contentment. There he says, but godliness, verse 6, actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. And if anyone could talk about contentment, it was the Apostle Paul. If you remember in Philippians chapter 4, he said that he had learned how to be content. He learned how to live in all different kinds of circumstances. And so as Paul is giving these instructions to Timothy in connection to contentment, we know that he is an experienced man. And he gives us several reasons why a person ought to be content. And this continues on in verse 7 where he says, for we brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. In other words, you can't take it with you when you go. So why get so distracted by accumulating so much stuff? Just be content with what you have. Any surplus that you have, you can't take with you anyways. And therefore, there's no need to run the rat race of trying to keep up with the Joneses and trying to amass a whole lot of wealth. And then in verse 8 he says, and if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. In other words, you can live off a lot less than you think you can. Here in the West and in the United States, we have a very high standard of living compared to the rest of the world. If we don't have a large house with several vehicles, with several TVs and all different types of electronical devices, we feel as though we are really doing without. But the scriptures tell us time and time again that if we have food to eat and if we have clothes on our back, that's the minimum. That's about what you need to survive at least. And therefore, we can live off of a lot less than we think we can. And when we come to that realization, it helps us to be content, because we're not thinking that I have to have, I have to have an income of over $100,000 a year in order to be actually well supplied. But we can live off of a whole lot less, and this scripture reminds us of that. And then he says we also need to be content because of the temptations that come in chasing after money. He says in verse 9, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. When we're living for money, when we're just trying to earn a lot of money, we open ourselves up to a lot of temptation. And we begin to have our priorities out of line, and that allows us then and compels us to then go down the wrong path. And so there's a danger in not being content, in that it might lead us down a dark road. And then he says in verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by aspiring to it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. In other words, there's dire consequences, bad consequences that could come by chasing after money and making our lives all about amassing a lot of wealth. He says there that it becomes a root of all types of evils, and that it can even cause a person to wander away from the faith. They can get so distracted by money, they just completely walk away from living a life of faith before the Lord, and you just don't see them anymore. And so we ought to live a life of contentment. Follow the instructions by the Apostle Paul. We need to remember that we brought nothing into the world, we can't bring it out, that we should be content with just food and clothing. Anything above that is just bonus, and that trying to be rich leads us into unnecessary temptation, and then also there are dire consequences and bad things that can come out of chasing after riches, and one of those being that we become distracted and we end up walking away from the faith. So these are strong words by the Apostle Paul, but very powerful words that can help us to readjust the way that we think, the way that we view ourselves, and we view our life circumstances, to remember that really our ultimate goal is to be serving God in His kingdom. And that's what we really should be looking after. He says godliness with contentment is great gain. We should be more focused on becoming more and more godly, more and more godlike, more and more like our Creator. And if we do that, then we're going down a path that's beneficial and helpful to ourselves, to others, for future generations, and just better all around. So here's some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.